Begin with character, end with character, find the story in between.
Start with that great premise. What if this happened? And then ask yourself, okay, now who would be the most interesting character to put into that dilemma?
Should a writer start with character or plot?
You know, I sometimes say that there are two kinds of writers, the ones that start with character, the one that start with plot. I think both are valid ways. I think, however, if someone starts with character, I wouldn't tell them that they're wrong and that they shouldn't. I think if you start with plot, it's a little easier to break story and to work with story. So like the example I was saying with Groundhog Day, you know, if you start with the premise is far more interesting than the character. What if somebody woke up and it was the same day a second time? That's a great premise, right? I want to start with that, then ask myself, well, who would be the most interesting character to put in that? What if it was somebody who was naive? That probably wouldn't work. What if it was somebody who was a jerk? Now, and that helps me build the plot and the character, right? So for me, it works much more naturally, and it's much more easy to work with story to start that way. That said, I know a lot of people who start with character. They love to explore character. That's, you know, and for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they came from an acting background, and that's part of acting training sometimes. They'd like to get inside a character's head. Maybe they're doing a biographical figure, and then you kind of have to, in a way. You are starting with the character, but you then need to decide what plot moments do I want to use to help show this character's change, and what plot moments am I going to leave out. But then you kind of necessarily are starting with character. But generally speaking, if I had to pick the two, I would say plot is the most easy to manipulate and to build story around, and to make sure you're creating a satisfying story. Start with that great premise, what if this happened? And then ask yourself, okay, now who would be the most interesting character to put into that dilemma?
Begin with character, end with character, find the story in between. I don't care what paradigm people have in terms of story structure, how you get there is critical. And so you start with your characters. That's my take. You know, again, there's not one right way to do this. I'm just saying that this, I think, is a smart way to go about it, because the characters, it's their story. If we're writing a story, we are assuming that in some magical, mystical way, that story universe exists. Those characters exist. And if it's their story, they know it better than we do. And so character development is about getting curious. It's about asking questions. It's about spending time with the characters. And so the typical things that we see, like biographies and questionnaires, those are great. I call those indirect engagement exercises, because you're reflecting on the character, you're thinking about the character, as opposed to direct engagement exercises. So for example, what if I have a character in mind? I'm going to imagine I'm a psychiatrist. This character is my patient. And if they're reticent to talk to me, I can even go one step further. They have been court appointed to appear with me as a psychiatrist, and they have to answer my questions. If they don't, they will stay stuck in this situation until they do. So you just create a situation in which, like I was saying earlier, you just ask questions. You get curious. That's a lesson I learned when I was an Air Force brat. You just ask people questions, you get them talking. And so you type, you just let it go. You can even do something, it's a little bit spiritual, I suppose you'd say, in a way, where you're gonna do either a monologue or a stream of consciousness with the character. It's sort of like a Vulcan mind meld, you know, like Star Trek, where you get a character in your mind and you do some deep breathing, you get yourself, so you're transitioning out of the busy world, and you're gonna be here now with this character. And you set a timer for like 15 minutes, and you put your fingers on the keyboard or pen on paper, and you close your eyes and you just type, and you just type. And you know, your mind will go, oh, I gotta get groceries or the cat and whatever. Just let that go. You don't get attached to it. You just keep coming back to this character. And you get done with this. And so you've got all these words that you've typed out. Some of them are like dialogue, like a monologue, and some of them are just like stream of consciousness. 80% of it may seem like gobbledygook to you, maybe 90%, but 20% or 10%, there's something really interesting that popped out there. And that's getting in touch with the characters at a subconscious level. And they start to talk to you. I've seen this happen time and time again. I created a prep class 10 years ago that I teach online, 6-week workshop, taking a story from concept to outline. And the first 4 weeks are all character development. The second week is brainstorming. That's all they do is brainstorm. And I've had hundreds of people tell me that was the most eye-opening experience for them, was doing that type of work. Again, the characters exist. We act on that belief. And we reach out to them and get them talking to us. So the character development, those are some great examples for character development. What can happen out of that is if you identify a protagonist in particular, their state of disunity, where they are disconnected from their authentic nature, and that can inform, if you know what the disunity state is, that can inform where the unity state is. And so now they're not going to just jump there. Then you're going to say, okay, so these plot elements and the characters with whom they intersect, they're going to deconstruct their old ways of being because they don't work out here in the new world. But in the process of that, they're going to uncover their need. Their need's going to start to emerge. This is very Jungian. Jung talks about, he says, when an inner situation is not made conscious, and he's talking about like conflict, inner conflict, it happens outside as fate. Now, I don't know if that's real in the real world, but that's the protagonist story. The protagonist starts off in a state of disunity, and what happens in the plot is informed by that. There's a synergy between it. It's not just these random events. It's like these characters that they intersect with and the events that they go through, that's going to provide the basis of their transformation. And so their disunity, that gets deconstructed. Well, now this stuff starts to come out into the light of consciousness, their need. And then they move into reconstruction. Now they're moving into their new mode of being and eventually toward unity. So you can take that raw material that you get with your characters and see how that starts to shape the nature of the plot, the story structure. And it's not just plugging this in, this has to happen on page 25, the break into Act 2. No, you're doing it through a much more organic fashion with your characters and letting them inform you what the structure will be. And the final value of that is that you're writing multi-layered, richly textured characters who actors want to play. So character development to me is like everything. It's absolutely critical.
For me, plot and the analysis of plot can be a real source of people getting stuck in their writing because they feel that they need to have a plot that works before they write. Now, if you just write without a plot, you can also end up down a dark hole of loose ends that lead nowhere and just write for the rest of your life without having a structure. But I find plot and the analysis of plot a good place to be once you've written something. But for me, plot arises out of characters in a space doing something. And that creates the plot. The characters themselves are almost, it's like this whole separation of character and plot is not actually real when you're either creating it or watching it. Character and plot are intrinsically linked. We separate them in order to analyze and maybe in the rewrite, write our stories better. But I do find that, so if you just focus on plot and drop the characters, it can result in stories that feel a bit empty. And it can result in stories that everyone's written before. What I find really funny about these books on plot, and some really good books are written on plot, and I point to them in my book. I don't talk about plot at all in my book. What I find really funny about books on plot is they'll say, these 7 beats need to be in a story. They don't have to be there in that order. They don't all have to be there. And I'm like, what do you mean they don't have to be there in that order and they don't all have to be there? This is it's like a weird, I don't know if you've read closely in this book, they've all got this disclaimer of like, they don't have to be in that order and they don't have to necessarily all be there. And I'm like, well, what are you really trying to say? So I'm slightly suspicious of generating your idea writing from plot first. I think it can be really useful in the rewrite. It's definitely really useful in the story edit. I use it all the time when I'm trying to help writers strengthen their stories. But actually, the best bit on plot that I've ever heard, the best quote on plot, and it's not even about plot, It's from that book on filmmaking that I mentioned earlier by Alexander McKendrick. He says something like, the only thing you need to know, what's happening now in your story should not be as exciting or interesting as what may or may not happen later. It's really simple.
Oh, wow.
What is happening now shouldn't be as interesting or exciting as what may or may not happen later. So something's happening later, and it's drawing the story forward. And it's that thing that's happening later that you need to put in your plot somewhere. So we need to know that something's going to happen in the, you need to set it up so that something's going to pay off, and that'll drive the story forward, and that'll keep people watching. But I like that because it's kind of an escapist, it's not really about plot, but it's kind of linked to structure in some way. So yeah, I'm not anti-plot, but as a matter of fact, I'm pro-plot when it comes to analysis of the story and trying to make it stronger. Because I do believe you have to take a sledgehammer to your story once you've written it and hit it. And if it breaks, something's wrong with the structure. And so you need to make it work.
Character is story, as I said before. What is a character other than what she does and what she says?
Okay.
I have a friend who is a TV writer, and he has a partner, a writing partner. They collaborate. And so he told me that somebody said to them, oh, you guys work together. So like you do the character and he does the story? As if you could do that separately. Characters don't exist outside of stories. They exist only inside of stories. Again, they are what they, like Hamlet, they are what they do and what they say. So you can't, when people talk about a character-driven movie, they just mean a good movie. Let me just point out to you how many movies and plays and great classics are just the name of the protagonist, of the main character. For example, Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar. That's just, how about go back to the Greeks? Medea, Oedipus. Look at the great movies, The Godfather, Citizen Kane. It's not always that way, but more often than not it is the name of the character that is also the name of the movie, the name of the protagonist. And I only mention it in this context because I'm trying to indicate to you that you can't separate story and character. Which is more important? It's like asking somebody, what's more important to you, your heart or your lungs? Sometimes in the law they refer to separately to plot and something they call sequence of events. But to me, plot and sequence is the sequence of events, is the story. Plot, sequence of events, story, these are synonyms, at least in lay terms, just, and it's the most important thing and the hardest, the most difficult, the most elusive thing to achieve is a good story. I could paint for you a word picture of a wacky, crazy kind of a character, and there are workshops that actually do this. You just invent characters, and you talk about what kind of a tree she would be if she were a tree, and what kind of candy bar she would eat if she ate a candy bar. And all of these, and people feel all kind of creative, they create these things, but it's nonsense. I think it's actually anti-useful because it suggests that characters exist outside of stories. What I want to hear is when students pitch their stories in my classes, they're orally telling the story to me and the 8 writers around the table, including themselves. What I want to hear is, what do we see and what do we hear? I don't want to hear that Harry enters. He's had a job years ago when he worked. They never got along with his mother. He's the kind of guy who does it. But please, just tell me, I mean, how is the audience sitting in the movie theater going to get that? They're going to get that from what they see and what they hear. Nobody's going to be sitting next to them whispering in their ear, let me tell you about this part that's coming up, what I was trying to do here. So that's what I want to hear in the class from the writers. We see this, we hear that. And that's what readers for agents and for production companies want to see on the page. We see this, we hear that. That's all there is. And everything else has to come out of that.
So finally, in answer to your question.
Yeah, I knew we'd get there eventually.
I told you this was
Okay,
foreplay.
Karen forgot the
This is
question.
I'm patient. Yeah.
Now, if you gave us a premise, we would eagerly take a shot at it, knowing that where we started would not be the place where it ended. Okay. And it was particularly fascinating in the book when we had teams working, where they would just, one would start riffing and the other would just pick it up, and then the other would go back with, and they'd just go back and forth.
Right. Or they would change the sex. They'd say, we don't know anything about mothers and daughters, but fathers and sons we know a lot about, so let's make it a father and son. Or in one case, my favorite interview, the grandparents are just lightly mentioned in the premise, and Lou Schneider made it a story more about the grandparents and the mother than the daughter. The daughter kind of got lost in it. So, that's the other thing is, I think that the book does something that I've never seen a book do before. It replicates, not because of us, because of the writers, it replicates what a writer's room would be like. Because a writer's room, you come in, you might have the arc of the season, you might have those things, but you need episodes along that line. And they'll pitch an idea and somebody go, that's not going to work, or we did that 3 years ago, or blah, 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 whatever it is. But ideas come in the room, and as Peter said, they are not the same at the end as when they start.
Now I'm going to take us back to your question.
Sure.
When Jeffrey and I were starting, we took a slightly academic view one day and said, what's your prediction about the approach they're going to take? Are they going to go more for story, or are they going to go more for character? And we found out the answer is neither. They went for conflict. And so if you were to give us a premise to develop, the very first step we would take is, okay, whatever the premise is, where do we get conflict out of it?
Okay.
If there are two characters involved, how can we make them butt heads to do something? Because everything would come out of that.
Again, there's not one right way to do this. I'm just saying that this, I think, is a smart way to go about it, because the characters, it's their story.
I sometimes say that there are two kinds of writers, the ones that start with character, the one that start with plot. I think both are valid ways.